Have you ever tried to tell a story about something that's happened that you know the first time that you tell it, it's you aren't going to get it all right, that you're going to make mistakes in telling it, and partially because you're thinking no one is ever going to believe this. Why would they believe this crazy story that I'm going to tell? Partially also that maybe it's hard just to get a sense of how everything fits together. What is it that ties all these events together in this story? It can be a challenge sometimes, even things that we have lived through, to be able to tell that story. I mean, just imagine what it's going to be like a couple of generations from now to tell folks about what happened in the second half of 2019 and the first half of 2020, and really all of 2020 at this point is going to be affected by this. I mean, imagine how we would tell this story and the things that went on. Because on the one hand, we could go back to July, and the United States women's national soccer team won the World Cup, and we were joyful about that. And then, we recognize other big sports achievements. The Chiefs won the Super Bowl. And then also, my friends from St. Louis would be upset with me if I didn't say this, even though it was before July, the Blues won the Stanley Cup. So was some things that went really well. Others things came to an end. The Avengers movie series, the last movie in the series came to an end. Star Wars finished out its third trilogy of a trilogy. I'm not sure how you have a trilogy of trilogies, but they did, and they finished out the third one. And before anyone becomes alarmed, there are already plans for continuations of both of those series in different ways and different formats and all that sort of thing. They aren't done, but if you need something that's continuing on, also probably still beyond this, Frozen 2 just came out this fall and gave us a whole new set of songs that we can all get stuck in our head. We almost lost Spider-Man, but the folks that were fighting over him got their act together and got that all squared away. In other news of pop culture, folks got really upset for a while because someone left a Starbucks cup in the middle of a scene of one of the last episodes of Game of Thrones. But don't worry, that got covered over pretty quickly because Disney Plus started. That's Disney's streaming service. Yes, they now have a streaming service for all of their stuff. And they introduced us to Baby Yoda, which meant the internet is still pretty much going crazy over a Baby Yoda. Speaking of crazy, there were crazy people that decided they wanted to try and raid Area 51. Sounds like a smart idea. And some of you even thought that, maybe if I run like a cartoon character, I'll be okay and I can make that happen. I don't know what they were thinking, but they thought they could. On the other hand, you had a 16-year-old climate activist who was making world leaders uncomfortable. I don't know what it says about the world leaders when they can be made uncomfortable by someone who is only 16, but there you go, that's what happened. On another side of things, Australia was burning. At times it felt like the entire continent was about to go up in flames, but that's okay, because I think around a similar time back in the United States, we were arguing over who had the best chicken sandwich, Popeyes or Kentucky Fried Chicken. The 2020 Democratic presidential nomination started off with a bang, with lots of people running and what seemed like this endless run of debates all over the place, to the point we were getting tired of it, and we thought it was going to go for a very long time until it didn't. When almost overnight, it seemed like everyone dropped out except the two old guys in the room, and then they were the only two that were left standing until they weren't, and one of them dropped out, and now things seem like they have come to a head. In the middle of all of this, people were getting sick, and we started hearing reports from another part of the world saying that folks were getting sick. Close to home, our football team did a great job, and they traveled very far in the postseason, and that caused problems for us here at home because we'd had a planning retreat scheduled that we had to reschedule due to a football game. And then the second time we'd rescheduled it, we had to cancel that one due to ice and snow. And we finally got to the third time's a charm, we got to do our planning retreat. But I will be the first to admit that I was more than a little nervous about the fact that I thought it might get canceled due to pandemic. But we got it in that time, but it wasn't too long after that things really began to change around us. Because those people that were getting sick, it was spreading all over the world. And by the time, if we were telling this story generations from now, by the time we would get to today, to Easter of 2020, we've been out of church for a month. Things have pretty well been shut down. We've been doing online worship services and doing an online Easter service. Holy Week has been canceled. The Easter Bunny is traveling around with gloves and a mask on. And we're all washing our hands. We're staying at home. And for the love of everything, we're trying really super hard not to touch our faces. That's where we find ourselves. Pretty sure I missed something in there. I don't know what, but there are a lot of things that could have been added to that. It's hard to keep things straight after all of that. And we've been living through all these things. You would think that being the ones that are living through this story, that we would have a better sense of it, be able to keep it together better. But the challenge is that we're going to tell the story different ways depending on where we are. The way I tell that story today is different than how I would have told it a month ago. And that's still going to be different than how I'm going to tell it a month from now. We're still figuring this out as we go. What's important isn't that we always get everything in the right order, though. What's important is that we tell the story. We have a unique place because we are in the middle of it, and that makes the difference. Now, throughout this week, we've been telling another story. And this is in our morning devotions that we've been doing. We've been following the story of Holy Week, starting from after Jesus made his triumphant entry into the city of Jerusalem, going all the way through to Jesus' burial after his crucifixion, and then in that in-between place between chapters 23 and 24 in Luke's Gospel on Saturday, we just kind of held there for a time to see what would happen next. Through all of this, we were looking for major themes that were going to tie this story together to help us make sense of it. And through the Holy Week story, we can identify some of those major themes. One was the role of the religious leaders in all of this. Another was the role that Jesus was playing in the midst of this story. And a third is the preparations that were being made really just kind of all over the place. And from that, there's a few things I want to draw out that help us put this story together so that we can make sense of all of these different events that were taking place. Because we remember, one of the things that I was constantly pointing out, that I'm sure that those of you that were following the devotions this last week got tired of, was me saying that, remember, we always have to read Easter into the events of these stories. Because we know how the story ends. We know that Easter is coming. And because of that, we read these stories very differently because we see them differently because of what has taken place. And so we take a look at these important pieces. And one of those is that everyone was preparing for something. There wasn't anyone who was just sitting around not doing anything and just waiting. And in fact, this is one of the biggest misconceptions of our time, is that we have a lot of folks who are sitting around saying, well, I'm just going to let Jesus take care of that. I'm just going to wait on Jesus because he'll handle all of that. And Jesus will handle things, and he will take care of things. But he doesn't call for us just to sit around waiting for him to do all of the work. All of this works because we are working in his direction, and we are following his lead to make those preparations. Jesus isn't an excuse not to do anything. Jesus is the authority. He is the authority that we need to be able to do. With him, we prepare in the right places. Which leads us then to the next piece of this story, which is, how do we know what to prepare for? Through these stories, we see two different ways of doing things. On the one hand, we have the religious leaders, and on the other is Jesus. The religious leaders were preparing for short-term gains. They saw an immediate problem that they wanted to take care of because it was Jesus. They saw him as a threat, and they wanted to remove the threat because of everything else that was going on around them. But Jesus was preparing his disciples for the long term. And doing that meant focusing on something very different. And this leads us to the third piece of things, and this is where we see the most difference. The religious leaders were focusing on themselves and their power, and that is inherently short-term thinking. Jesus was focusing on the needs of his disciples, the needs of the people that were gathered around them, and the needs that were coming in the future, because Jesus knew how the story was going to end, and he knew what was coming after that. And so he was focusing on those needs as well, looking farther than just what is happening in the immediate moment. And he knew how to shape that story. With that, he was able to focus on those long-term preparations. We see him share in communion for the first time with his disciples. And we hear his command for his disciples to take their wallet, to take a bag, and to take a sword. Not two swords. One of them wanted to take two swords. Jesus said, "No, just one. You're dangerous enough with that one, but just take one." But this was in direct contrast to what he had told them before when he had sent them out previously in this gospel. He said, "Don't take anything." But he knows what he's sending them out for. And so he's preparing them for that, saying, make your preparations, get ready to go and to do. Because he also knew, because we see him predict this, that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, that the temple was going to come crashing down. Now here's where we see a difference, though. Because Jesus said these things, and he was catching a lot of trouble from the religious leaders for this. But he said the spirit of those things, of Jerusalem and of the temple, most importantly, would still go on, but the man-made parts of those structures would come falling apart. But Jesus says, here's how I can show you to get through that when it comes. And so what we see, starting on Easter morning, is Jesus at work, helping his followers to make sense of what's been happening. The first part of the story comes in Luke 24, verses 1 to 12, and it's the story of the empty tomb. But it's not just that the tomb is empty, it's who is there to tell the women when they come that the tomb is empty. It's two men in gleaming bright clothing, or as the NIV says, their clothes gleamed like lightning. And it's them who are telling the women that the tomb is empty, that Jesus has risen. This is the supernatural at work. This answers the question on whose authority Jesus is doing all of these things. Remember back earlier in the gospel, Jesus was asked by the religious leaders, on whose authority do you do this? He asked them a question in return, and he didn't give them an answer then to their question because they couldn't decide. They couldn't decide how they were going to answer it because they didn't want to be wrong. They let their own pride and self-importance get in the way. But now we see Jesus answer the question, on whose authority is he doing this? Messengers from God are at the tomb telling the women that the tomb is empty. This is on whose authority Jesus is doing these things. God is at work, and his authority is there and in place. And he was telling them that your faith has not been put in the wrong place, that you are on the right track. Just trust and have faith. And then there's the next part of the story. We get to the road to Emmaus. This is verses 13 to 35, where Jesus is continuing to reinforce what he'd been preparing his disciples and his followers for. He spends the trip to Emmaus telling these two guys about all the things that they had missed. Two guys who thought they knew what it was that Jesus was teaching, but now he is teaching again, reinforcing what had been taught, correcting where it needed to be corrected, helping them to more completely understand what had been going on, because he is continuing to get them ready for what is to come. Because remember, Jesus wasn't looking at the short-term gain, but at the long term. In this moment, in a time of great crisis, he can remind them that this isn't a surprise that these things are happening, that he knew that this was coming, and that it's okay because he is still at work. And then they are amazed at the end of the journey when they are sitting down breaking bread together, that they see that it was Jesus with them the whole time. Jesus is reminding them that they were made ready for this. And because of that, then they were ready to return to Jerusalem and tell the rest of the disciples what it was that they had seen. And then finally we get to the last part of this, verses 36 to 49, when Jesus appears to his disciples. Now, we have to be careful not to skim over this part of the story either, because it's easy to do because, well, Jesus appears to the disciples, everything is good, they know he's alive, that he's not in the tomb, and everyone sings Kumbaya, and we're good. They think that's how we skim over that part of the story sometimes. Because it's not just that Jesus was appearing to them, because they had their worries about that. Everything that we see Jesus do in this part of the story is him reminding his disciples of who he is, helping them to know that he is here. He says, come and look, touch. He sits down and he eats with them. They see him eat. There was this thought in that time that angels didn't eat food, so this was his way of saying, I'm not an angel. I'm not just like an apparition or a ghost or something, that I'm not just a spirit, that I'm not anything else than who I am, a real live person who was killed, who was crucified, but who has risen from the dead, and I am here with you. This is a crazy story that is being told. There are so many different pieces to it. There are so many different things that are going on around it. What holds all of this together, though, is Jesus. It could be a hard story to tell. In fact, it is a hard story to tell until we remember that we read it from beginning to end, knowing how the story ends. When we know that Easter is coming, the rest of the story falls into line because we're building to that moment. And everything looks different because of what we see on Easter morning. First, what we see is that authority comes from Jesus Christ. And we see him constantly throughout the Gospels. When we know that Easter is coming, we see him acting continually with that authority that comes from the fact that he is God. And that when we act under that authority, then we can be made ready to start in the right place. And this is followed by focusing on the long term. Strictly focusing on short term restricts what we can do and who we can be. But when we know that we act under Jesus' authority, then we can prepare for the long term, knowing that we are working in the right direction. And that right direction is determined by needs and not by building up our own power or our own importance. We don't need to build up power or importance when we act under Jesus' authority because we can never compete with that. When we take that motivation for power out of it, then we can truly meet the needs of the world. And through that, not only do we make the world a better place, but most importantly, we show that God has been at work the whole time and he is the one that makes it possible. We live in a world that has been disrupted by so much, where so many of the normal pieces of our lives have stopped or have changed dramatically. We don't know when things are going to return to normal. We don't know what normal is going to look like when we get through, except that we're pretty sure it's not going to be what we knew. The promise of Easter is that we are witnesses to something greater. That in the moments when everything feels like we're a part of a story that a 4-year-old is telling, the empty tomb tells us that we can go on, that we can have hope for the future, that we can endure our suffering now because Jesus can't be held back. Go out and be Easter people, even from your own homes. Where we're gathered isn't as important as the fact that we gather. Getting the story in all the right order isn't as important as remembering that the story happened. Doing everything right doesn't mean anything unless we are actually doing something. The hope of Easter is that all of this is possible and that we can live in that light. Go be Easter people and know that our Savior is risen and that has changed everything because we know how this story ends, and because of that we can make it through these hardest of times that we face because we know under whose authority that we act. We know that we are being prepared for the long journey, and we know that in those moments that we can have faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And so go and be those Easter people. And go and be them in the name of the one who has risen from the dead and shows us the way. Go in the name of Christ. Amen.